I didn't know my new house was hiding such disturbing secrets. My name is Claire Miller. I'm 29 years old, and I moved to Millbrook, New York, to start a new life. After a complicated divorce, the idea of starting over in a small town seemed ideal. The house I bought had everything I needed: history, charm, and an affordable price. But there was something no one mentioned. On the very first day, while exploring the rooms, I noticed a door in the ceiling of the second-floor hallway. It was small, with a rusty lock and scratch marks around it. I found it strange but decided to ignore it. Maybe it was just attic access, nothing more. At least that's what I thought. That night, while organizing my books in the living room, I heard a sound from upstairs. It was subtle, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house's old heating system. Later, when I went upstairs to my bedroom, I noticed something odd. The attic door, which I was certain had been closed, was now slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine. I tiptoed over and shut it, turning the lock firmly. "You're imagining things, Claire," I murmured to myself, trying to shake off the unease. But that night, I woke to the sound of something heavy being dragged again. This time, it seemed to come directly from the attic. The next day, I called the realtor who sold me the house, but he was evasive when I asked about the door. "It's just the attic," he said. "Probably old stuff up there, nothing to worry about." But there was something in his tone that left me unsettled, as if he knew more than he was letting on. Later, while walking around the neighborhood, I asked some residents about the house. Most avoided the topic, but an older woman who introduced herself as Edna gave me some answers. "That house used to belong to Margaret Blackwood," she said, lowering her voice. "She disappeared years ago and no one ever found out what happened. Some say she was different." "Different how?" I asked, intrigued. Edna hesitated, glancing around before continuing. "They say she performed rituals. Strange things in the attic. I've never been inside, but I've heard stories. If I were you, I'd stay away from that place." When I returned home, the attic door seemed to stare at me like a challenge. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but something about that door deeply unsettled me. I grabbed some tools and decided to open it. After much effort, I broke the rusty lock. A folding ladder dropped down from the ceiling, revealing the entrance to the attic. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a small, dusty space. I climbed up slowly, and the smell of mold and something metallic, maybe dried blood, filled my nose. The attic was full of old boxes, and in the center was a rocking chair. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn with something that looked like red paint, but seemed disturbingly fresh. Around the room, old porcelain dolls were arranged on shelves, all with expressions of frozen terror on their faces. The rocking chair had something carved into its wood. "Always watch." My heart raced. As I stepped back, I tripped over something on the floor, a piece of broken mirror. Holding it up, I noticed the doll's eyes reflected in the surface, but something was off. They weren't looking in the same direction as in reality. It was as if they had moved. I hurriedly climbed down from the attic and locked the door again. I decided I needed to get rid of those things as soon as possible. The next day, I took the dolls and the chair outside and left them on the curb to be picked up by the garbage truck. But when I woke up, I heard the sound of the rocking chair creaking again. I went to the attic, my heart pounding. All the dolls were back on the shelves. The chair was exactly where I had found it, rocking gently as if something invisible was sitting on it. In the silence of the room, I heard a low, childlike giggle. I wasn't alone. I knew something was wrong with that house. From the moment I found the attic, it felt like the energy around me had shifted. The dolls, the rocking chair, and the symbols on the walls. It was all part of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. But now, I had no choice. The next morning, while cleaning the living room, I noticed something strange. The dolls, which I had only seen in the attic, were now scattered across different rooms in the house. One was in the kitchen, another in my bedroom, and a third on the porch. They all seemed to be staring directly at me, as if they were watching. I needed answers. I decided to go back to the attic, but this time I was prepared. I grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver for protection, though I had no idea what I'd be facing. When I opened the attic door, the coldness was even more intense than before. The air felt heavier, as if I were wading through icy water. I climbed the steps slowly, and the beam of the flashlight lit up the walls. The symbols had changed. Now they seemed to move, as if alive. In the center of the attic, the rocking chair was still, but something new had appeared. Beneath it, the floor was scratched with circular marks. It looked like some sort of altar. That's when I saw the diary. Under a loose floorboard, I found an old notebook, its cover worn and its pages yellowed. I opened it carefully, and Margaret Blackwood's words began to tell her story. She had lost her young son Samuel in a horrific accident. Devastated by grief, she spent years studying forbidden rituals, believing she could bring him back. The attic was her altar, and the dolls were vessels for lost souls. Margaret believed that if she completed the ritual, she could resurrect Samuel. But something went wrong. Her final notes were confused with phrases like, "They're not him," and "The door is open, but I can't close it." As I finished reading, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around quickly, but no one was there. Just the dolls, still on the shelves, seemed to stare at me with greater intensity. The rocking chair began to creak on its own, swaying back and forth. Suddenly, a shadow took form in the corner of the attic. It was tall, with vaguely human contours, but distorted. Two glowing eyes stared at me, and then I heard the voice. "You've opened the door again." It was a feminine voice, but distorted, as if several people were speaking at once. "Margaret?" I asked, trying not to show fear. The shadow moved closer, and then I saw her. Margaret Blackwood, or what was left of her. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, but there was something hauntingly human in her expression. "Complete the ritual," she commanded. "Bring him back." I knew she was talking about Samuel, the altar, the dolls. It was all part of her plan to finish what she had started. "I won't do it," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret advanced, and the attic began to tremble. The dolls fell from the shelves, and the rocking chair toppled over on its own. "You don't have a choice," she said. "The door is open, and something must pass through it." The floor began to crack, and a red light emerged from the fissures. The air grew heavy, and I could barely breathe. I grabbed the diary and ran for the exit, but the attic door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I knew what I had to do. I threw the diary onto the altar and used the flashlight to set it on fire. Margaret screamed, a deafening sound that pierced my ears. The dolls began to melt, and Margaret's shadow twisted as if it were being torn apart. "You don't understand," she murmured as she faded. "Now you're marked." When the diary turned to ash, the attic fell silent. The red light vanished, and the door swung open. I ran downstairs, grabbed my things, and left the house that very night. I never went back, but something tells me I didn't truly escape. Weeks later, I found one of the dolls in the back seat of my car. On its base, a phrase was etched: "She always watches." I've always been drawn to places no one else dared to explore. My name is Evan Carter, and when my friends mentioned the abandoned junkyard on the outskirts of Phoenix, I immediately agreed to check it out. It seemed like the perfect spot for an adventure. At least, that's what we thought. That evening, we drove to the site as the sun dipped below the horizon. I was in the car with Taylor Green, my boldest friend, who always had a wild idea up her sleeve. In the back seat were Mason Lewis, the group's joker, and Sophie Ramirez, the quietest but also the most sensitive to things others didn't notice. When we arrived, the junkyard was far more intimidating than I had imagined. Cars were stacked into precarious towers, and shards of metal littered the ground. A rusty gate creaked in the wind, producing an eerie, high-pitched sound. At the center of the junkyard stood a small shed, partially collapsed, with loose shingles and broken doors. "Think we'll find anything cool?" Taylor asked, laughing. "Probably just a tetanus shot," Mason quipped, kicking a pile of rusty bolts. But Sophie stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the shadows between the cars, as if expecting something to emerge. We entered the junkyard with our flashlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating the rusted debris. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of metal shifting in the wind. At the heart of the junkyard, we found something unexpected, an improvised altar. It was made of welded scrap metal, surrounded by extinguished candles and strange symbols etched into metal plates. Animal bones were carefully arranged around it, and on top of the altar lay a piece of metal inscribed with an unfamiliar language. "What kind of people do something like this?" Mason asked, trying to mask his unease with humor. "A cult," Sophie replied in a low voice, "and from the looks of it, they left something unfinished." "Don't say that," I retorted, but my curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the metal piece from the altar, feeling its cold weight in my hands. The inscription seemed ancient, and for a moment, a strange chill ran down my spine. Taylor stepped closer. "Maybe you should put that back, Evan." "It's just a piece of metal," I replied. But as soon as I placed it back on the altar, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No more creaking metal or rustling leaves. It was as if the entire junkyard was holding its breath. "This isn't normal," Sophie whispered, her wide eyes scanning the surroundings. And then we heard it. A deep sound, like metal dragging across the ground, echoed through the junkyard. It was slow and heavy, coming from everywhere at once. I tried to stay calm, but the noise persisted, growing closer. I pointed my flashlight at a nearby stack of cars and saw something that made my heart stop. The shadows were moving. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but it wasn't. A tall, shapeless shadow glided between the cars, watching us without getting closer. "What is that?" Taylor asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the stacks of cars began to groan. Pieces of metal clattered to the ground, as if something was deliberately shifting them. We ran toward the exit, but the path was unrecognizable. The stacks of junk had rearranged themselves into a labyrinth that hadn't been there before. "This can't be happening," Mason shouted. "We just came through here." The sound of dragging metal grew louder. Then we heard footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone walking in iron boots. "Something's surrounding us," Sophie said, gripping my arm tightly. "It's not human." We tried to find a way out, but every path led us back to the altar. Shadows danced around us, and low metallic laughter echoed through the air. When we returned to the altar, we saw something new. At its peak was a figure made of metal, shaped almost like a human, but grotesque. Its eyes glowed faintly red, and the thing seemed to be breathing, as if alive. "You've opened the door," a deep voice said, echoing through the junkyard. "And now I am free." I looked at my friends, and the terror in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. There was no escape. The sound of metallic footsteps seemed to draw closer with every passing second. It felt as though the junkyard itself was alive, surrounding us and guiding us straight into the grasp of whatever I had unleashed. "What the hell is happening?" Mason shouted, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "This isn't real." "It's real," Sophie replied, her voice low and trembling with fear. "And it won't let us leave." The figure on the altar began to move. Its grotesque form, made of molten, shifting metal, seemed to melt and reform with every step. Two eyes glowed a fierce red, and a deep, muffled laugh reverberated through the air. "You opened the door," the voice said. "Now someone must stay." "Stay?" Taylor asked, backing away. "What does that mean?" The figure advanced slowly, pointing a sharp metallic claw toward us. "A sacrifice, a soul to replace mine." We tried to run, but the stacks of cars shifted as if alive, blocking our paths. Running through the labyrinth was futile. Every exit we found seemed to vanish before our eyes. "Evan, you touched the altar," Sophie said, her desperate eyes locking onto mine. "This is your fault." She was right, but I didn't know how to fix it. As we stumbled through the maze, I remembered the inscriptions on the metal piece I had picked up from the altar. Pulling it from my pocket, I stared at the strange, faintly glowing marks. "What does it say?" Taylor asked, her panic barely contained. "I have no idea," I admitted. Sophie grabbed the object and studied the inscriptions. "It's a ritual," she said. If we complete it, maybe we can trap it again. We found temporary refuge in the shed at the center of the junkyard. While Sophie frantically worked to decipher the ritual, the sound of grinding metal grew louder. The air felt heavier, pressing in on us. "He's coming," Mason muttered, peeking through a crack in the door. Outside, the grotesque figure moved steadily closer. The ground trembled beneath its steps, and the shadows around it writhed like living arms reaching toward us. Finally, Sophie figured out the ritual. We had to recreate the symbols on the altar using pieces of metal and our own blood. "Will this work?" I asked, clutching a shard of metal with trembling hands. "It'll either work or we'll die," Sophie replied grimly. We returned to the altar cautiously, the entity trailing us. Taylor began sketching the symbols with the metal shards while Mason and I cut our hands, using our blood to draw as instructed. The air grew heavier and the metallic figure paused, watching us intently. "You think you can imprison me again?" the voice boomed, resonating inside our heads. "You are weak." The altar began to glow faintly, and the figure suddenly charged at us with terrifying speed. "Finish the ritual," I yelled, holding up a shard of metal in a feeble attempt to block its path. But it was too late. Azrael, as Sophie had named it, lunged at Mason. He screamed in agony as the metal around him seemed to fuse with the creature's shifting form. "It's taking me," Mason shouted, panic overtaking him. That's when Sophie came up with a desperate idea. "Azrael wants a sacrifice," she said. "If it thinks it's already claimed one, we might have enough time to finish." Before we could stop her, Sophie threw herself onto the altar, screaming at Azrael. "Here's your soul!" The entity hesitated, as if trying to comprehend her actions. We seized the moment to finish the symbols, using every drop of blood we had left. The altar's glow intensified, and Azrael let out a deafening, guttural scream as its metallic form began to disintegrate. The shadows that surrounded it dissolved, and the junkyard fell into an eerie silence. When it was over, Sophie lay unconscious on the ground but alive. Mason was covered in cuts and bruises but seemed okay. The altar, however, still emitted a faint glow, as if waiting for another chance to be activated. "Let's get out of here," Taylor said, helping Sophie to her feet. We left the junkyard that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Weeks later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a piece of metal engraved with the same inscriptions from the altar and a single chilling phrase: "I will return." My grandfather, Jack Donovan, was the most skeptical man I ever knew. He didn't believe in ghost stories, had no patience for superstitions, and always told me that everything in the world had a logical explanation. That's why, when he told me about what happened at the Empire Cinema in Illinois, I believed him. He would never share something like this if it weren't true. "Nathan," he began one evening, looking at me with a grave expression, "this story isn't to scare you, it's to warn you. There are places that should never be revisited." At the time I was a teenager and I loved hearing his tales. But this one was different. It was darker, more real. It all happened in the late 1950s when my grandfather was 19. He lived in a small town near Springfield, Illinois, and, like any young man, loved hanging out with his friends. Back then, the Empire Cinema was a local legend. It had been closed since the end of World War II and was known for its grand architecture, and rumors of something strange happening during its last screening. Jack and his friends, Tom, Eddie, and Marianne, received mysterious invitations to a special screening. The invitation read, "A final screening of The Door to Eternity. Come and witness an experience that transcends cinema." They didn't know who had sent the invitations, but their curiosity got the better of them. "It was just a movie, right?" my grandfather said. "What could go wrong?" On the night of the screening, they arrived at the Empire Cinema. The place was magnificent, even in its state of decay. Dusty chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the walls were covered in peeling layers of paint. The box office was empty, but the doors were open, as though the cinema had been waiting for them. The atmosphere was strange, my grandfather described. There was something in the air, like time itself was trapped in that place. Inside, they found other people, no more than 15 in total. The other attendees were quiet, their expressions distant, as if they were there against their will. Jack found it odd, but didn't think much of it. The lights dimmed, and the screen lit up with the image of a black and white film. It was titled The Door to Eternity. The movie followed a story about a secluded mansion and a family dealing with unexplainable events. It was dark, but not unlike other films of the era. Then something changed. As they watched, Jack noticed that the characters in the film began behaving strangely. They started looking directly at the camera, directly at the audience. At first, it seemed like an unusual artistic choice. But then one of the characters, a woman in a white dress, pointed toward the audience. Jack felt as if she was staring straight at him, and it wasn't just him. Marianne gripped his arm, whispering, "They're looking at us, Jack." Murmurs began spreading among the audience, and some tried to leave, but the doors were locked. The woman in the film took a step forward, out of the screen. Panic erupted in the theater. The woman walked between the rows of seats, her footsteps making no sound. Jack tried to stand, but it felt like his body was paralyzed. He glanced at Tom, who whispered, "This can't be. This isn't real." But it was real. One of the audience members, seated near the aisle, screamed as the woman placed her hand on his shoulder. He began to convulse as though being pulled into something invisible. On the screen, the image changed. The man was now in the film, staring at the audience with wide eyes and an open mouth, frozen in a silent scream. "I was frozen," my grandfather told me. "I didn't know what to do. There was no way out, and that thing was hunting us." He tried to stay calm and observe what was happening. That's when he noticed something odd in the projection booth. A bright light was flickering inside, like a malfunctioning projector. He had an idea. If he could get to the booth, maybe he could shut it off and stop whatever was happening. "It was my only shot," he said. But the path to the projection booth was filled with shadows that seemed to come alive. Jack knew that to escape, he would have to confront whatever the cinema was projecting, both on the screen and beyond it. My grandfather said he had never felt as much fear as he did that night at the Empire Cinema. As the characters from the film stepped out of the screen, each of their movements made the impossible seem real. He knew he had to reach the projection booth, but the path there grew more treacherous with every step. "That place was alive, Nathan," he told me, staring straight into my eyes. "It was as if the cinema itself knew I wanted to escape and was doing everything it could to trap me." As Jack and his friends tried to plan their escape, another of the audience members began to scream. He was being pulled toward the screen, his legs already engulfed by the projector's light. Jack watched in horror as the man vanished, only to reappear in the film as another character, now a part of the cursed mansion. "I knew that if I stayed still, the same thing would happen to me," Jack said. Jack convinced his friends to head toward the projection booth, but the cinema reacted. The seats groaned, and the shadows on the walls began to move, stretching like arms reaching out to grab them. Tom tripped and nearly got caught, but Jack managed to pull him up at the last second. When they finally reached the staircase leading to the booth, Jack felt something was wrong. The light from the projector was now blindingly bright and emitted a pulsating sound like a heartbeat. "I felt like the entire cinema was watching me," he said. Every step felt like a test. Halfway there, Jack noticed Marianne had stopped. She was staring at the screen, mesmerized. "They're calling me," she said, her voice low and distant. Jack tried to pull her away, but it was as if she were glued to the floor. Suddenly, the woman in the white dress appeared behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Jack shouted for her to run, but it was too late. Marianne was dragged into the screen, her screams echoing through the theater. On the screen, Jack saw her standing at one of the mansion's windows, pounding on the glass as if pleading for help. Finally, Jack and the two remaining friends reached the projection booth. Inside, they found an old projector emitting the pulsating light. On top of the machine sat a film reel labeled "The Door to Eternity." "Destroy it!" Tom yelled. But when Jack tried to touch the reel, the light seared his hand. At that moment, a voice echoed through the booth. "You cannot leave. You are already part of the story." The room began to shake, and the figure from the film appeared on the other side of the booth's glass, staring directly at them. It seemed to grow larger, its face filling the window, a blur of shadows and hollow eyes. Jack realized the projector was the key. If he could shut it down, he might be able to stop the film and escape. But the machine seemed to be protected by an invisible force. I had to risk everything, he said. He grabbed a chair and smashed the projector's glass. The moment it shattered, the light flickered violently and the sound of the film cut off. The theater was plunged into an eerie silence, followed by a deafening scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows on the walls disintegrated, and the characters who had emerged from the screen froze in place before vanishing. Jack and his friends ran for the exit, which was finally unlocked. As they stumbled outside, the first rays of sunlight began to appear, and the Empire Cinema was eerily silent. My grandfather said that while he had escaped, he never truly felt free. "That place marked me, Nathan," he said, "and I never understood why." Years later, while helping him organize his belongings, I found a box of old keepsakes. Inside was a small strip of film. When I held it up to the light, my blood ran cold. It was an image of my grandfather as a young man, staring back at me from the film strip. Behind him, the woman in the white dress stood, smiling. My name is Rachel Parker, and if there's one thing I've learned over the past month, it's that some things should remain buried. When I moved to Black Ridge County, North Carolina, I was seeking peace and quiet. As a history teacher, the idea of living in a place with such deep roots was enticing. Little did I know it would be that very past that would turn my life into a nightmare. It all started on a quiet afternoon. I was cleaning up the yard of my newly purchased house, a modest wooden structure surrounded by oaks that seemed to watch my every move. While clearing the accumulated leaves near an old arbor, I felt something hard under the shovel. I started digging, thinking it might be a rock or a piece of rusty iron. But what I found was something very different. It was a metallic object, covered in dirt and moss, shaped like an oval amulet. Its surface was engraved with symbols I didn't recognize, even with my knowledge of history. There was something unsettling about it, as if it carried an energy I couldn't explain. As soon as I held it, I felt a faint warmth pulsing against my skin, and the impression that something invisible had just awakened. I brought the amulet inside, carefully cleaned it, and tried researching it. My books offered no answers, so I took a few photos and sent them to colleagues who might help. That night, I left it on the living room table and went to bed, but my sleep was disturbed by a dream that felt so real I woke up in a sweat. In the dream, I stood in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. At the center there was a woman with black hair tied to a stake, fire rising around her. Her face was serene, almost resigned, as dozens of masked figures watched. When the flames reached her body, she opened her eyes and looked directly at me, whispering, "You have been chosen." I woke up with a scream caught in my throat, my heart racing. I looked at the clock. 3:33 a.m. In the living room, the amulet seemed to faintly glow, as if it were alive. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to bed. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. It started subtly. Objects I was certain I had left in one place appeared elsewhere. Lights flickered without reason, and the amulet always seemed to catch my attention, as if it were begging me to hold it. When I finally gave in and picked it up again, something changed. The moment my skin touched the metal, a wave of heat shot up my arm, and my vision blurred. Suddenly, I was seeing the kitchen of a neighbor, Earl Morgan, a lonely man who lived a few houses away. He was handling a vial of poison, pouring it into a glass of wine while muttering something about money and freedom. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving me gasping for air. At first I thought it was some kind of hallucination, but when I heard the next morning that Earl had died in a strange accident, the poison he had intended to use on his wife spilled and killed him, I froze. The vision was real. I had known what was going to happen before it happened. Curiosity quickly turned into a burden. Every time I held the amulet, the visions came, growing more intense and disturbing. They didn't just reveal future events, but also the dark secrets of those around me. Lies, betrayals, hidden desires. I discovered the local baker was stealing money from his employee, that the sweet old church lady had poisoned her husband 30 years ago, and that my own best friend Sarah was planning to betray me to get a promotion. I didn't want these visions, but it seemed the amulet was shaping me, turning me into a tool to uncover truths that should have stayed hidden. When I tried to get rid of it by throwing it into a nearby river, the object reappeared on my table the next day, clean and intact. The days went by, but the amulet wouldn't leave me. It seemed to grow heavier, as if it were accumulating something. Secrets, perhaps, or lives. The visions became more intense, showing not just the future, but things I couldn't explain. Flashes of places I'd never visited, faces I didn't recognize, screams that seemed to echo from a distant past. After the last dream of the woman in the clearing, I decided I could no longer ignore what was happening. Her name, Margaret Bell, appeared in my mind as if etched in fire. I researched local library records and discovered that Margaret had been executed for witchcraft in 1683. She was accused of using an amulet similar to mine to manipulate fate and condemn her enemies. But the most disturbing discovery was this. The clearing where she had been burned was in the woods behind my house. That night I decided I needed to confront the truth. I grabbed the amulet, now pulsing with an almost unbearable heat, and walked to the clearing under the pale light of the moon. The trees around me seemed taller, darker, leaning in as if to block my path. When I arrived, I saw the site wasn't empty. Ancient stone circles marked the ground, each engraved with symbols identical to those on the amulet. At the center was a makeshift wooden pedestal, burned and weathered by time. As I approached, the wind picked up and I heard whispers around me, soft, mocking voices speaking all at once. "You've brought the amulet back. It always returns." I spun around, but no one was there. The shadows seemed to dance between the trees, and the whispers grew louder until a sound split the air, distorted laughter coming from all directions. Her voice was next. "You shouldn't have dug, Rachel. Now you belong to it." Margaret Bell's figure appeared before me, dressed as she had been in my dream, but her face was burned, her eyes black and glowing like embers. She moved closer and my body froze, as though bound by invisible chains. "Power comes at a price, but you can still choose. Pay it yourself, or pass it to another. Leave the amulet here and go, or keep it, and rule fate for a little while longer. But remember, every choice has its cost." I wanted to scream, to throw it down and run, but something inside me hesitated. The amulet seemed to vibrate in my hand, whispering words I didn't understand but which seduced me. "Control," it said. "Power." As I stood paralyzed by the decision, the clearing began to change. The ground cracked and shadows emerged from the fissures, stretching out long skeletal arms toward me. Margaret disappeared, but her laughter echoed as the shadows closed in. "Make your choice," one of the voices shouted. With a cry of desperation, I threw the amulet onto the pedestal and collapsed to the ground. The shadows stopped for a moment, as if watching me. The amulet glowed brightly, emitting a piercing sound that made my ears throb. A burst of light filled the clearing, and everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the amulet was gone, and the clearing was empty again. The sky seemed darker, the air heavier. I thought I was free. I thought it was over. I returned home, but the sense of freedom didn't last. The dreams continued, not of Margaret or the amulet, but of something greater, something beyond the clearing. A faceless figure, cloaked in black, appeared every night, pointing at me. I woke up feeling as if I were being watched. One day, as I cleaned the table where I used to keep the amulet, I found a message carved into the wood. "The collector always finds new bearers." My blood ran cold. I ran to the mirror, and for an instant I saw another version of myself, an older Rachel, with empty eyes and a smile that wasn't mine. When I blinked, the image was gone. That's when I realized I was never in control. The amulet might have been left behind, but the price remained. And it would keep watching me, waiting for the right moment to claim its due. I never expected that to happen to me. To be honest, I never believed in legends or superstitions. My life was built on facts and evidence, not ghost stories or monsters hiding in the dark. But everything changed when I got the call to investigate the case of Carl Beaumont, a man who disappeared in the dark swamp 20 years ago and returned as if no time had passed. My name is John Mathers, and I've been a detective for over 15 years. I've seen things that would make most people quit this job, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that swamp. The case started as something straightforward, a missing man reappearing. Carl Beaumont had been presumed dead 2 decades ago after vanishing during a night of fishing. When he returned, he looked exactly the same as when he disappeared. No wrinkles, no signs of aging. The problem was, Carl couldn't speak. He didn't make a single sound. He just stared at everyone with empty eyes, as if trapped in some kind of trance. The first time I saw him was in an interrogation room at the county station. He sat at the table staring at the wall. When I sat across from him, he slowly turned his head and looked directly into my eyes. I'll never forget that look. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was as if he knew something I didn't, something no one was meant to know. After a few minutes of absolute silence, Carl started scratching the table with his fingernails. At first I thought it was a nervous habit, but I soon realized he was drawing. The symbols were strange, circular, resembling some kind of ancient alphabet. Once I finished photographing them, he finally spoke. "The water waits. You mustn't go in." The words came out in a raspy, drawn-out voice, as if he hadn't spoken in years. Before I could ask anything, Carl began screaming and thrashing, forcing the officers to remove him from the room. I was left alone, staring at the symbols on the table, trying to make sense of what was happening. The name Dark Swamp appeared several times in Carl's files. It was where he had disappeared, and it seemed to be the source of all the dark tales in the area. Locals avoided the place, calling it cursed. Some spoke of spirits. Others mentioned something far worse, a cult worshipping an entity in the waters. I ignored the warnings and decided to visit the site. I arrived at the swamp at dusk, just as the sun was disappearing behind the tall, twisted trees. A low fog crept along the ground, covering the dirt path leading to the entrance. The sound of insects and birds was constant, but there was something else, a low, rhythmic sound like soft splashes on the water. As I walked, I began noticing symbols carved into the trees and stones along the way. They were the same drawings Carl had etched into the table, and they were everywhere. The wind carried a stench of decay mixed with the damp scent of the swamp. It felt like the whole place was alive, breathing around me. After about an hour of walking, I came to a clearing where the fog was thicker. At the center, I saw an altar made of stacked stones, covered in moss, and surrounded by extinguished candles. The ground around it was wet, with traces of recent footprints. Kneeling to examine the candles, I noticed dried blood on some of them. While I was there, I heard a sound that froze my blood. Laughter. It wasn't human. It had a distorted tone, like something trying to imitate a voice. I looked around but saw no one. Still, I felt like I was being watched. Then I noticed the shadows. Among the trees, hooded figures began to appear. They didn't move, just watched, like statues. What little daylight remained seemed to vanish, leaving only the swamp's darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound in control. No response. The figures stayed where they were, motionless, but somehow I felt they were smiling beneath their hoods. As I began to back away, I realized the path I'd taken had disappeared. The swamp had shifted, as if it were swallowing me. The sound of bubbling water came from the altar. When I turned back, I saw something moving slowly on the swamp's surface. It was massive, with glowing eyes that seemed to fix on me. I knew I shouldn't be there, but it was too late to run. The shadows remained still, but the overwhelming sensation that they were getting closer was suffocating. I tried to recall the path back, but the swamp felt like a labyrinth. The altar in the clearing still bubbled, and the glowing eyes in the water had vanished, as though watching me from somewhere else. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. My job was to uncover the truth about what happened to Carl Beaumont, but every instinct in me screamed to run. Except there was no way out. I was trapped in the heart of the dark swamp. The whispers began as I moved. low at first, then rising in volume. They weren't clear words, just fragmented phrases that seemed to enter my mind. You shouldn't be here. Blood is the only answer. I moved away from the altar trying to find a landmark, but everything looked the same. Twisted trees, moss-covered stones, and that oppressive fog that hid the ground. Then I noticed something unsettling. The symbols on the trees were changing. What had been mere markings now looked like eyes watching me. I quickened my pace, but soon stumbled into another clearing, larger than the first. At its center was a circle of hooded figures murmuring in a language I didn't understand. On the ground lay a victim, or what remained of them. Their skin was pale, covered in markings identical to Carl's, and their eyes were completely black. I tried to step back, but my foot landed on a branch, snapping it. The sound echoed like thunder, and the figures stopped their murmurs. Slowly, they all turned toward me, their faces still hidden beneath their hoods. He's here. The next has arrived. The voice came from a larger figure at the center of the circle. He stepped forward, pulling back his hood. His face was covered in scars, etched with symbols like those carved into the trees. His eyes were a glowing, inhuman yellow, and he held a staff made of bones. You came to meet our master. Now he will come to meet you. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the ground itself was holding me in place. The figures began closing in, forming a circle around me. The moonlight disappeared behind heavy clouds, leaving only the swamp's darkness. The water at the center of the clearing began to churn violently, and a deep, guttural roar filled the air. Something began to emerge. At first it looked like a mass of mud and algae, but it quickly became clear it was alive. A colossal head surfaced, covered in eyes that shone like beacons in the darkness. They moved independently, all fixing on me. The creature had long skeletal arms that ended in sharp claw-like fingers, and its heavy breaths made the ground tremble. The master demands an exchange, said the man with the staff. You entered the waters. Now you belong to them. I don't belong to any of this, I shouted, struggling against the invisible roots holding my legs. The entity leaned closer, one of its massive, glowing eyes just inches from my face. I felt a terrible heat emanating from it, mixed with a stench of decay so vile it nearly made me faint. My mind was on the verge of collapse as images flooded my vision, past sacrifices, people dragged into the depths, and the colossal figure rising to claim more victims. If you refuse to join us, you must choose, said the man with the staff. Bring another, or take their place. I understood what he meant. I could leave, but only if I brought someone else to the swamp, someone to take my place in the cycle of sacrifices. The thought of condemning another life to save my own was unbearable, but what choice did I have? Before I could decide, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was pulled into the dark waters. The sensation was one of absolute cold, and everything around me fell silent. The entity's eyes surrounded me, watching as I sank. But instead of dying, I awoke on the swamp's edge at dawn. I was alone, my clothes dry, but my left arm was marked with symbols identical to Carl's. I looked toward the swamp and saw the reflection of the entity in the water. It wasn't done with me. I knew that. When I returned to town and tried to warn the authorities, no one believed me. Carl disappeared again, and the locals continued to avoid the swamp. But at night I still hear the whispers, and I know that one day, when my will falters, I'll have to make the choice: offer another soul or return to the waters myself. The mirror stared back at me as if it were alive. The reflection wasn't mine. It couldn't be. In the mirror, my face was covered in deep wrinkles, my eyes were hollow, and my smile was twisted, cruel. The sound of whispers filled the room, and the figure in the mirror tilted its head. Then it spoke, using my voice, but older, darker. You will become me soon. I screamed, but no one heard me. It all started a few days ago when I was hired as a guide at Sarah Bell Manor, one of the oldest houses in Savannah, Georgia, and known for its history of secrets and tragedies. I've always been fascinated by old stories, but I never truly believed in the supernatural. Ghosts were just fabrications to lure tourists, and I thought my job was to bring those stories to life convincingly. The mansion was breathtaking, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floors that creaked with every step. But what stood out the most was the mirror in the grand hall. It was massive, with ornate golden edges carved into the shape of eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. Legend had it that the mirror was a wedding gift from a European merchant to Sarah Bell, but ever since it arrived, strange things began happening. Visitors were always asking questions about the mirror, and I'd respond with the same story I'd learned during training. Sarah Bell spent hours in front of it, as if speaking to someone, and after her death, people reported that the reflection showed wrong things. On my first shift as a guide, a group of tourists remarked on how the shadows in the mirror's reflection seemed to move on their own. I dismissed it as a trick of the light. But that night, when I locked up the mansion alone, I decided to take a closer look at the mirror. That's when everything changed. At first, it seemed normal. My reflection stared back at me, nothing out of the ordinary. I ran my fingers along the golden edges, admiring the intricate craftsmanship, marveling at the artisan's skill. But as I studied the mirror, I noticed something in the reflection that made my heart stop, a figure in the background. It was a woman with long hair and an old white dress. She had her back to me, but when I turned to look directly at the hall, there was no one there. Yet in the mirror, the woman was slowly turning toward me. Her face was distorted, as though someone had stretched her skin in unnatural directions, and her eyes glowed like tiny points of light. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion. But that night, as I slept, I dreamed of the same figure. She sat before the mirror, brushing her hair, and her soft, distant voice whispered something I couldn't understand. The next day, I found an excuse to avoid entering the grand hall. The mansion felt darker, heavier, as though something unseen was watching me. Determined to uncover more about Sarah Bell and her mirror, I went to the local archives. What I found left me even more unsettled. According to old accounts, Sarah Bell believed the mirror was a gateway to another world. She claimed she could speak to spirits and even see the future. But over time, she began complaining that they were trapped in the mirror, trying to get out. Shortly before her death, she wrote in her diary, "The mirror sees more than it should. I hear my own reflection whispering." The diary also noted that anyone who spent too much time before the mirror eventually disappeared. The mirror stole something from them, Sarah wrote. When I returned to the mansion that night, I felt drawn to the grand hall as if something were calling me. The mirror seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as though it had been waiting for me. Despite the fear clawing at me, I approached and stared into my reflection. But this time it wasn't just me. Behind me, in the reflection, I saw dozens of figures, men, women, and children, all standing still, staring directly at me with lifeless eyes. They weren't in the room, only in the mirror. My breathing quickened, and then suddenly my reflection began to change. My reflection winked at me. Not me, the reflection. And then it smiled. "Come," said the voice in the mirror, sounding exactly like mine. I stumbled backward, trying to retreat, but I tripped and fell to the floor. When I looked back, the room was empty. My reflection appeared normal again. But I knew something had changed. The mirror wasn't just an object, it was alive, waiting. And now it knew who I was. The Ferris wheel spun slowly, emitting a high-pitched metallic sound that tore through the silence. The lights that flashed in faded colors made no sense. There was no electricity in the park. Emma grabbed my arm, her pale face reflecting the fear I felt. "Jake, we need to get out of here," she said, her voice barely audible over the booming music of the carousel. We made it to the gates, but they were locked with thick chains that hadn't been there when we arrived. I tried to force them, but it was useless. I looked around looking for another way out, but the park seemed to have changed. The paths we had taken were different, as if the rides had moved. Suddenly, the sound of the carousel stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, looking back. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed in the distance, as if someone was running between the rides. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but all I saw were shadows moving too fast to be human. "Jake," Emma began, but her voice trailed off. I followed her gaze and saw something that chilled me to the bone. Near the Ferris wheel, a figure stood. He was dressed like a clown, but the costume was dirty and torn. His face, partially covered by a faded mask, seemed twisted into a grotesque smile. He didn't move, but I knew he was watching us. "Come on, now!" I pulled Emma by the hand, trying to get us away from there. We ran aimlessly, passing stalls and rides, but the park seemed endless. Every corner took us back to places we had already been, as if we were trapped in a maze. The music came back, but this time it came from all sides, as if the entire park was alive. A mechanical sound mixed with the melody, and I realized that the roller coaster was working. Their rusty cars moved along the tracks by themselves, and children's voices echoed, laughing and shouting, but there was no one there. Emma stumbled and fell beside me. As I helped her up, I noticed something in her hand. She had found a piece of paper on the floor, crumpled and dirty. I unfolded it and saw a list of names written in shaky handwriting. At the bottom, the last two names were ours, Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. "This can't be," I whispered, feeling panic overcome me. Emma began to cry. "Jake, they knew we would be here." Before we could think of another way out, the sound of footsteps came again, closer this time. Shadows began to form around us, and indistinct figures emerged from the rides. They were children, or what was left of them. Their faces were distorted, and their eyes glowed with a dull hue. They began to walk toward us slowly, as if they were surrounding us. The clown appeared again, this time closer. His grotesque grin widened, and he pointed toward the Ferris wheel, now spinning faster. "This way!" I yelled, pulling Emma toward a game booth. We hid behind the counter, trying to control our breathing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that looked like a key hanging from a nail. I grabbed it, hoping it was the key to the gates. "We need to get back to the entrance," I whispered. Emma nodded, and we ran as fast as we could. The figures began to move faster, their screams and laughter filling the air. We reached the gates, and I tried to fit the key into the lock. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. The key turned. The chains fell with a crash, and the gates began to open. But before we could get out, Emma screamed. I looked back and saw that she was being pulled. One of the childlike figures had grabbed her leg, and the others were closing in, dragging her back. "No!" I ran to her, trying to free her, but the shadows were too strong. Emma looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Go, Jake, get out of here." "I won't leave you," I screamed, but the shadows swallowed her completely. I stood still for a moment, unable to process what had happened. Then, I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned and saw the clown, his eyes now glowing brightly. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, through the gates and throwing myself onto the deserted road. Days later, I found the strength to go back with the police, but the park was no longer there. The place was empty, covered in trees and vegetation, as if the park had never existed. The only thing left was the diary we found, now with 2 more names added to the list, Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the carousel music. For Sarah and me, escaping the city wasn't just an idea, it was an obsession. The endless traffic jams of Dallas, the frantic pace, and the stifling monotony of office life had eroded our joy for living. We were searching for something more, something that could reignite our sense of adventure and connect us to a world beyond screens. It was Sarah who suggested exploring Black Ridge Forest in Colorado. The name conjured images of majestic peaks, vast stretches of forest, and the kind of silence only nature can offer. We didn't hesitate. We packed our bags, ignored our friends' warnings, and set off. After all, what could go wrong on such a well-planned getaway? For the first few days, everything went exactly as we'd imagined. The crisp, invigorating mountain air, the scent of pine trees, and the breathtaking views of peaks veiled in a light mist made us feel we'd made the right choice. That first night, we camped in a safe spot, sticking to marked trails and the advice of other hikers we knew. But deep down, that wasn't what we truly wanted. We admitted this to each other while having dinner around a campfire. "Mark," Sarah said thoughtfully, staring into the embers, "I want more. I want a real adventure, something that doesn't follow a script." I smiled, knowing exactly what she meant. I replied with a suggestion that changed everything. "What if we take one of the less-traveled trails tomorrow? Something off the tourist maps." She hesitated for a moment, but then her eyes lit up with that spark of adrenaline that bound us together. "Yes," she said with conviction. The next morning we packed up and ventured down a smaller, almost hidden trail. As we progressed, the vegetation grew denser, and signs of other campers began to vanish. We passed tranquil streams, towering trees, and an almost otherworldly silence. Hours later, we stumbled upon a small village on the edge of the forest. The locals eyed us curiously, and with a hint of apprehension. While buying supplies in a tiny shop, an elderly woman with gray hair approached us. "You shouldn't venture deeper into the forest," she said firmly. "There are wild animals and other things that can cause trouble." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, laughing nervously. She hesitated before continuing. "Illegal loggers and other things. It's not safe." We thanked her for the warning, but dismissed it. The idea of animals or rumors about loggers seemed like an exaggeration meant to deter curious tourists. We laughed about it as we left. The trail gradually disappeared, and we found ourselves surrounded by dense trees. The birdsong was replaced by an oppressive silence. By midday, we stumbled across signs of human activity. Fallen trees and freshly cut branches. The air carried the strong scent of newly chopped wood. Shortly after, we encountered a group of men armed with rifles and machetes, their clothes dirty and their expressions weary. They looked visibly uneasy at the sight of us. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, asked curtly, "What are you doing here?" "We're just hikers," I explained, "looking for a place to camp." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances before the tall one warned us. "It's not safe. There are things in this forest no one should see. Turn back while you can." Something in his eyes looked more frightened than hostile. Sarah squeezed my hand, nervous, but we pressed on, ignoring the warning. That night we found a clearing near a stream and set up camp. The forest silence was deafening, almost unsettling. While Sarah tried to mask her unease, I couldn't shake the men's warning from my mind. In the middle of the night we heard strange sounds. Soft footsteps, as if something or someone was circling our tent. We convinced ourselves it was just nocturnal animals. But at dawn the silence was shattered by a distant gunshot. "It's probably a hunter," Sarah murmured, trying to sound nonchalant. Another shot rang out, then several more, as if something was being chased. But when the gunfire ceased, the silence returned, heavier than before. The next day we ventured even deeper into the forest until we found something we couldn't ignore. Enormous footprints, a mix of paw and hand-like impressions. The tracks were far too large to belong to any animal we knew. "This isn't normal," Sarah whispered, uneasy. I agreed, but pushed us forward, trying to dismiss the growing sense of dread. As night fell again, the sounds of the forest grew more distinct. Footsteps, guttural noises, and finally, something that chilled us to the bone. A voice perfectly mimicked the tone of the man who had warned us. "Turn back now. It's not safe." But the voice was distorted, almost inhuman. The sounds around the campsite grew more intense, as though something or someone was circling us. The distorted voice we had heard the night before echoed in our minds, repeating the same phrase. "Turn back now, it's not safe." Sarah and I barely slept. Every noise, a branch snapping, the rustle of leaves, made our hearts race. By morning, the atmosphere felt even more oppressive. The sun, which should have illuminated our path, barely penetrated the dense canopy, leaving us in a constant twilight. As we packed up the campsite, we found something that made our unease worse. Near where our backpacks had been, there were deep marks in the ground. They were the same enormous footprints we had seen before, half humanoid, half animal, and they had now circled our tent. "Mark, we need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. I agreed, but we couldn't just retrace our steps. Something told us we wouldn't be alone if we did. We decided to move forward, hoping we'd eventually find another village or a main trail. However, the forest seemed to grow denser and more oppressive. The silence was so absolute that even our footsteps felt intrusive. Around midday, we came across another sign of human presence: abandoned tools, including chainsaws and handsaws, all left in a rush. Some were still full of fuel, ready to use, but the area was completely deserted. "Why would they leave everything like this?" Sarah asked, looking around. Before I could answer, we noticed scratch marks on several nearby trees. They were deep gouges, as if something had passed through, leaving a trail of destruction. By late afternoon, our discomfort turned to pure fear. The forest silence was shattered by a distant noise, heavy footsteps accompanied by a low, guttural growl. We froze in place, holding our breath, but the sounds grew closer. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Sarah's hand. We ran as fast as we could, dodging branches and fallen logs. Behind us, the sound of footsteps grew louder, as if something massive was pursuing us. Suddenly, we burst into a clearing, where we stopped to catch our breath. The noise had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Then we heard the voice again, now much closer. "If you're smart, leave the forest now." This time, the voice didn't come from any specific direction. It seemed to echo from all around, distorted, almost metallic. Sarah started crying, and I knew we had to leave immediately. Night fell before we could find a way out. We set up camp in silence, but we didn't dare light a fire. We tried convincing ourselves we were safe, but the sounds around us wouldn't let us relax. Around midnight, we heard the sound of something heavy approaching again. The ground trembled slightly, and there were scratching noises outside the tent. I held Sarah's hand as she tried to muffle her sobs. Suddenly, something began hitting the tent forcefully, clawing at the fabric and letting out low, guttural growls. We squeezed our eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but the sound persisted. Then we heard gunshots, loud and rapid, cutting through the silence. Whatever had been attacking us retreated, letting out a high-pitched, inhuman scream. We scrambled out of the tent to find a group of armed loggers, their faces tense and weapons at the ready. The leader of the group, the same man who had warned us earlier, glared at us. "I told you. That thing wanted to take you." The men explained that the creature inhabiting the forest was a skinwalker, a being that guarded the area and attacked those who disrespected its territory. The offerings they usually left to keep it at bay were no longer working, and the creature had grown more aggressive. 2 of their colleagues had recently vanished, including the man who had warned us in the village. "You need to leave now," he said, pointing toward a trail that would lead us out of the forest. The next morning, we followed their directions, grateful for their help. Each step out of the forest felt like shedding a massive weight. Yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave us. Before we fully exited, I glanced back one last time. In the shadows of the trees, I could swear I saw something. A tall, distorted figure with glowing eyes watching me. "Mark, let's go," Sarah called, her voice trembling. We returned to civilization, but we could never forget what happened in Black Ridge Forest. To this day, I avoid any mention of the place. Nature holds its secrets, and some of them are better left undisturbed. I'll never forget that night. For any veteran trucker like me, the solitude of the open road is an old companion. But that night, something very different happened to me, something I've never been able to explain. I was heading home, driving along the long and desolate Highway 285 in New Mexico. It was the kind of night where the road seemed endless, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on my shoulders like a stone. The dashboard lights illuminated the cab, and the radio, my faithful companion, played songs I barely registered. I stopped at a lonely rest area to stretch my legs and grab some coffee. The air was cold and the sky was clear, filled with stars. That's when I noticed a man walking toward me. He was trudging along the roadside, carrying a worn backpack and wearing a crumpled hat. "Hey, buddy," he called out, his voice rough and a little desperate. "Could you give me a ride to the next station? My car broke down and I'm stranded out here." I hesitated. I knew picking up strangers wasn't ideal, but something in his voice, a mix of need and desperation, convinced me. I waved him into the cab. "What's your name?" I asked as he climbed in. "John," he replied. "Thanks a lot, man. It's freezing out here." At first, the conversation was friendly. John seemed like a simple guy, but there was a strange melancholy in his words. He mentioned he was headed to Santa Fe to deal with some family matters. When I pressed for details, he turned his gaze to the window as if avoiding the topic. "Family can be complicated," he finally said, stroking what appeared to be a photograph in his hand. I glanced briefly at what he was holding. It was an old black and white photo of a woman with a sad smile. The radio began to crackle. I turned the dial, trying to adjust the frequency, but only managed to get more static. "Strange. It never acts up here," I muttered. John didn't respond. He just stared at the road, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. A few hours later, he suggested we stop at a diner he claimed was just ahead. "The coffee there is great," he said with a tone of nostalgia. What struck me as odd was that I'd never noticed a diner on this route before, and I knew it like the back of my hand. Still, I agreed. I could use the rest and a good cup of coffee. Minutes later, the diner's lights came into view. It was a small place with a flickering neon sign. "Diner 66, the sign read. A few old cars were parked outside, and the facade had a retro vibe, as if it had been plucked straight from the 1950s. We walked in together. The place was surprisingly busy for the hour. A waitress approached us with a smile that felt more automatic than genuine. "What'll it be?" she asked, jotting notes on a small pad. "Coffee for me," I said. "And you, John?" "The same," he replied, but his eyes were fixed on something at the back of the diner. I turned to look, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just an old jukebox playing a slow, melancholic tune. As we waited, an odd feeling filled the air. The coffee arrived, but the smell seemed wrong. It carried a metallic scent, like rusted iron. A shiver ran down my spine. I glanced at John, who now looked serious, as if he'd noticed it too. "We need to leave," he said suddenly, leaving his coffee untouched. "What? We just got here," I protested. He didn't answer, just gave me a look that made me uneasy. I paid quickly and we left. Back in the truck, everything felt different. The air was heavy, and the engine, which usually started on the first try, sputtered a few times before roaring to life. We drove in silence, but something about John had changed. He seemed tense, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if something was following us. "Did you see that?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. "See what?" I replied, confused. He shook his head as if deciding it was better not to explain. "Just drive." So I did. I kept my eyes on the road, but couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. In the distance, I could still see the diner's flickering sign, but for a brief moment, I swear I saw something else. A tall, shadowy figure standing in the parking lot, staring directly at the truck. I pretended I hadn't seen it and focused on the road, but my heart was pounding like a drum. A short while later, John asked to be dropped off at a gas station, saying he'd handle the rest of the trip from there. When I stopped, he got out quickly, but before leaving, he left something on the passenger seat. It was the photograph he'd been holding earlier. When I looked up again, he was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. That night still haunts me. I've never been able to find Diner 66 again or figure out who John really was. But every time I drive down Highway 285, I feel a presence, as if something or someone is still watching me. After John disappeared at the gas station, the unease stayed with me. The photo he'd left on the passenger seat seemed to call out to me. I held it in my hands and studied it more closely. It was an old, black and white photo of a woman with a melancholic expression. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "To John, with eternal love. Emily, 1956. A chill ran through me. Who was Emily? And why had John been carrying this photo on such a strange night? I needed to keep driving. I started the truck, but the engine sputtered before finally roaring to life. The road ahead felt darker and more desolate than before, and the radio was still nothing but static. To make matters worse, a thick fog began to form, reducing visibility to just a few meters. As I drove, the unsettling feeling that I was being followed grew stronger. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty. Still, the sensation gnawed at me as if something unseen was watching my every move. Then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from the radio amidst the static. The voice was low, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to say my name. Michael. My heart raced. I quickly turned off the radio, but the whisper continued, now coming from somewhere inside the cab. Michael, you need to go back. Gripping the wheel tightly, I focused on the road. There was no way I was going back, to that gas station, that diner, or to John. All I wanted was to get off this cursed highway. Not long after, I spotted the lights of another gas station. Relief washed over me. Perhaps this was my chance to escape the nightmare. I pulled in and parked, still clutching the photo. Inside the convenience store, a wiry man with gray hair stood behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound calm. "Evening," he replied, not looking up. I placed the photo on the counter. "Do you know this man?" He got out at the last station but vanished. The attendant glanced at the photo and his expression instantly changed. He picked it up gingerly as though it might shatter and studied it for a long moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I explained everything, picking up John, the diner, the photo he'd left behind. The attendant shook his head, incredulous. "That's not possible," he murmured. "John and Emily died on this highway over 60 years ago. It was a bad accident near mile marker 104. My blood ran cold. "You're saying he's..." The man nodded slowly. "People have reported picking him up before. He always appears to weary truckers, especially at night. And he always leaves something behind, like he's trapped between this life and the next." I left the station trembling, still holding the photo. The man advised me not to look back as I drove, but of course I couldn't help myself. A few miles later, the fog grew even thicker, and I started hearing whispers again. This time the voices weren't calling my name. They were crying. The sound seemed to come from all directions. Then the radio turned on by itself, playing the same slow, mournful tune that had played at the diner. I tried to turn it off, but the buttons wouldn't respond. That's when I saw it in the rearview mirror, something that nearly made me lose control of the truck. John was sitting in the passenger seat again. He stared at me, but his face was no longer human. His eyes were dark voids, and a twisted grin stretched across where his mouth should have been. "You shouldn't have come, Michael," he said, his voice echoing like thunder. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to escape. The truck felt sluggish, as though an invisible force was holding it back. The music grew louder, almost deafening, and the cab lights flickered erratically. Suddenly, everything stopped. The truck skidded off the road, but miraculously, it didn't crash. I climbed out to check my surroundings, only to find the highway eerily empty. There was no sign of John, the diner, or anything out of the ordinary. I got back into the truck, exhausted and shaken. The photo of Emily was still on the passenger seat, but now something was different. In the background of the image, a shadowy figure stood behind Emily, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Since that night, I've avoided driving on Highway 285 after dark. I never saw John again, but his presence still haunts me. There's something on that road that doesn't belong to this world, something that waits patiently for those foolish enough to pass through. My name is Robert Hall, and I've spent my entire life in the heart of Montana. I'm a lumberjack and carpenter, just like my father before me, and his father before him. From a young age, I learned to respect the forest, to listen to its sounds and silences. To some, these trees are just timber waiting to be cut, but to me, they have a life of their own. That day began like any other. I woke before sunrise. The morning air was cold, and the sky was slowly brightening. My wife, Linda, was still asleep as I donned my hat, adjusted my machete, and left the wooden house we had built together. My dog, Duke, followed me as always, wagging his tail eagerly for another day in the clearing where I usually worked. The spot was an hour's walk from home, but I knew the path by heart. The forest around me felt calm, filled with the usual sounds of the wind through the trees and birds chirping. I chose a tree I had marked the week before. It was tall, healthy, and ready to be felled. As I prepared my tools, I heard something unusual, a sharp, constant sound like a whistle coming from all directions. I stopped and looked around. Duke was alert too, his ears perked up. It wasn't the sound of a bird or the wind, and it unsettled me. I decided to ignore it and continued working, but the sound persisted. In fact, it seemed to grow louder. When I finally decided to investigate, I noticed Duke acting strangely. He paced back and forth, his nose low to the ground, sniffing the air. I followed him into the forest, thinking it might just be a small animal. But as we ventured deeper, the sound grew closer, surrounding us. The vegetation became thicker, and sunlight barely filtered through the canopy. With each step, the sense that something was wrong grew stronger. It felt as though the forest around me was alive, watching my every move. Suddenly, Duke stopped. His fur bristled, and he began growling softly. I scanned the area, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost deafening. A shiver ran down my spine. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. The forest no longer felt like the familiar place I had known all my life. I decided to head back home, but I realized I had wandered farther than I thought. The path seemed unfamiliar, as though the trees had rearranged themselves. Duke walked ahead of me, but even he seemed unsure of where we were. Finally, after what felt like hours, I emerged from the woods and reached the edge of the clearing where my house stood. My wife was outside near the chicken coop gathering eggs. When she saw me, her expression changed. "Robert, are you okay?" she asked, dropping the basket. I just nodded, not wanting to worry her, but Linda knew me too well. She could tell something was wrong. "Did something happen? You're so pale." "It's nothing," I lied, though the truth was I was still trying to process what had happened. That night, as we sat down for dinner, I told her about the strange sound and how the forest had felt different. To my surprise, Linda had her own story to share. "This morning, while you were in the forest, I heard a strange sound too," she said hesitantly. "It was like a whistle coming from everywhere. And the chickens, they just froze, like they were in a trance." A chill ran through me. It was impossible to ignore the connection between what I had experienced in the forest and what Linda had witnessed at home. We decided not to dwell on it, convincing ourselves it was just a coincidence. But deep down I knew something was wrong. The forest I thought I knew so well was hiding a secret, and perhaps I had ventured too close to uncovering it. The following days were strange. Although Linda and I tried to return to our routine, something lingered in the air, like a shadow that couldn't be seen but could be felt. The sounds of the forest had changed. The morning birdsong, once a constant, had vanished, replaced by a heavy, unsettling silence. One night I woke with a weight on my chest. Opening my eyes, I saw Duke sitting by the bedroom door, staring intently down the dark hallway. He wasn't growling or barking. He was completely still, like a statue. "Duke, what's wrong, boy?" I whispered, but he didn't respond. I got up, grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed, and stepped into the hallway. The silence was so profound I could hear my own breathing. At the end of the hallway, I noticed the back door was ajar. Something told me not to go outside, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the door fully, the forest looked different under the pale moonlight. The trees were shrouded in a thin mist that seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. And then I heard it. The sound. The whistle. That same whistle I'd heard days ago echoed through the forest, but this time it was closer. It felt as though the night itself had found a voice, a constant whisper calling out to me. Without thinking, I started walking toward the sound with Duke close at my heels. The vegetation was denser than I remembered, and each step seemed to draw me further into the darkness. The whistle grew louder, filling my head with a mix of fear and fascination. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing. At its center, something made me stop in my tracks. A circle of ancient stones covered in moss stood around a small fire burning in the middle. There was no one in sight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice small and fragile against the vast silence. No one answered. Only the whistle remained, now so loud it felt like it was coming from inside me. Suddenly, Duke began barking furiously. He was fixated on the edge of the clearing where the shadows of the trees grew denser. Following his gaze, I saw something move. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, its silhouette slender and distorted. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its movements were erratic, as though it moved to a rhythm that didn't belong in our world. A paralyzing fear gripped me, but before I could react, the figure began to advance. Duke charged toward it, barking and growling, but before he could reach it, the thing vanished, dissolving into the mist as if it had never been there. The whistle stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and Duke's frantic barks. I ran back home with Duke at my side. Once inside, I locked every door and window, but the feeling that we were being watched didn't leave. Linda woke up startled when I entered the bedroom, sweating and trembling. "Robert, what happened?" she asked, alarmed. "It's out there. Something's out there. We have to leave." She didn't question me. We began packing our things, but before we could leave, the house was swallowed by an almost tangible darkness. The lights flickered, and the whistle returned, now louder than ever. Duke barked desperately, running back and forth. When I went to the window, I saw something I'll never forget. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, staring directly at me. Its glowing eyes bore into mine, and a twisted smile stretched across its face. Somehow, we managed to leave the house that night. We ran to the car and drove away without looking back. As we sped down the road, the whistle followed us, echoing like a macabre melody. It wasn't until we reached the town that the sound finally stopped. We went straight to a motel where we spent the rest of the night in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. We never returned to our house in the Blackwater Forest. Whatever we faced that night, it wasn't something that could be explained. The forest held a presence, something ancient and unwelcoming, something that didn't want to be disturbed. Sometimes I still hear the whistle in my dreams. I've never believed in ghost stories, much less demons. My name is Nathan Carter, and I'm a skeptic by nature. I grew up hearing tales of witches and hauntings in Salem, Massachusetts, the town that has become synonymous with hysteria and death. I always assumed they were just stories to attract tourists. When my wife Lila and I bought our first house in Salem, we knew it had a storied past. It was a 17th century building with crooked walls and an attic full of cobwebs. But the price was irresistible, and the realtor assured us that everything was in perfect condition. The one detail he didn't mention was the basement, not because it was broken or dilapidated, but because no one wanted to talk about it. Our move-in went smoothly at first. The neighborhood was nice, the neighbors were friendly, and the house seemed to have its own personality. But there was something strange. The basement was locked with old, rusty padlocks, and there was no sign of a key. At first, we thought it was a mistake. Maybe the previous owner had forgotten to give us the keys. I called him, but got no answer, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. One night, I went down to the basement with a pair of bolt cutters and started cutting through the locks. The sound of the metal creaking seemed to echo through the house in a way it shouldn't. Lila stood in the doorway, holding a flashlight and eyeing me nervously. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked. "It's just a basement, Lila. It probably has old tools or boxes of junk." As the last lock fell off, a horrible smell of mold and something else, something metallic like blood, filled the air. Lila stepped back, covering her nose with her hand. I slowly opened the door and a wave of cold air hit me, as if we were entering an ancient cave. Lila's flashlight illuminated the narrow wooden steps that led down into darkness. Something in the background seemed to glow faintly, like recently extinguished candles. "Must be a crack in the floor," I muttered, trying to ignore the shiver that ran down my spine. We made our way down the steps carefully, and the flashlight revealed what appeared to be an empty space. But as we moved forward, the room began to take shape. The floor was stone, marked with carved symbols I didn't recognize. The walls were covered in fingernail marks, as if someone had tried to get out of there. In the center of the basement was a circle drawn on the floor, with candles arranged around it. They were unlit, but the air seemed to vibrate as if an invisible energy was still trapped there. "Nathan, this isn't right," Lila said, her voice shaking. I bent down to examine the circle, but before I could touch it, I heard a low, guttural sound coming from somewhere in the darkness. "Who's there?" I asked, but my voice echoed back to me, distorted. Lila tugged at my arm. "Let's get out of here now." As we hurried up, the basement door slammed shut, trapping us in darkness. Lila screamed, and the flashlight fell to the floor, shattering. We were left in total darkness, the metallic smell now unbearable. I heard slow, heavy footsteps echoing around us. They weren't ours. "Nathan," Lila whispered, her voice thick with dread. A red light began to glow in the circle in the center of the basement, as if lit by something invisible. The marks on the floor began to glow as well, and a tall, skeletal figure emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing like embers. "You opened the door," said a deep voice that seemed to come from inside our heads, "and now you can't close it." The thing took a step forward, and I felt my body freeze. Lila was crying, but she couldn't move. The air felt too heavy to breathe. "What do you want?" I managed to mumble. The figure laughed, a sound that reverberated through the basement and caused the candles to spontaneously light. "I want freedom. I want the world, and you have brought me the first offer." The tall, skeletal figure watched us from the center of the circle, its eyes glowing like embers, lighting up the darkness. The air around us vibrated with an energy that seemed to erode our sanity. Lila sobbed beside me, but I knew running wasn't an option. The door was shut, and the presence before us wouldn't let us escape. "You set me free," the entity said, its voice echoing through the basement, "but the sacrifice is yet to be made." My heart froze. Sacrifice. The word weighed like lead in my ears. "Please, we didn't mean to do anything," I shouted. "We'll close the door, we'll leave. You'll never see us again." The creature tilted its head as if considering my words. Then it took a step toward Lila. "A trade must be made. You opened the door. Now one of you must stay so it remains open." Lila screamed, trying to back away, but her body seemed frozen in place. I couldn't leave her there. "Take me," I said desperately. "Let her go." The figure laughed, a deep laugh that made the basement walls tremble. "This doesn't depend on you, human. She's already been chosen." The marks on the floor began to glow even more intensely, and the circle of candles blazed with red flames. A thick black smoke started rising from the ground, enveloping Lila. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. Without thinking, I ran toward her, trying to pull her out of the circle. But the moment I crossed the glowing line, an intense pain shot through my body, as if I were being burned from the inside out. "You can't interfere," the voice echoed again. "This is the will of the blood spilled here centuries ago. The door will open completely and the world will see my glory." Suddenly, I heard a loud bang on the basement door. It was like an electric shock cutting through the oppressive silence. "Nathan, Lila, are you there?" I recognized the voice. It was Father Donovan, a man we'd recently met at the local church. We'd talked to him about the history of the house, and he'd warned us not to mess with the basement. I hadn't taken him seriously, but now his words came back to me with terrible weight. "We're down here," I shouted with all my might. "Please, help." The door burst open with a bang, and the priest ran down the stairs holding a crucifix and a Bible. As soon as he entered, the creature let out a deafening roar, retreating to the center of the circle. "You do not belong to this world, spirit," Donovan shouted, raising the crucifix. "Return to the darkness from which you came." The priest began reciting words in Latin, and the creature howled in fury. The basement floor began to crack, revealing an abyss below, from which an intense red light emanated. The air grew heavier, and I could barely breathe. Lila, now free from the circle, collapsed to the ground, coughing and sobbing. I ran to her and pulled her back while Donovan continued the exorcism. "Don't leave the basement yet," he ordered. If you cross the door now, the ritual won't be complete. Close your eyes and don't open them until I say." We obeyed, holding on to each other while the priest faced the demon. The sounds of the battle seemed to fill every corner of the basement. Screams, prayers, and the sound of something breaking like glass. Finally, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the basement was dark again, and the circle on the floor had disappeared. The priest was kneeling on the ground, exhausted, but alive. "It's done," he said, his voice weak. "But never come back here. This house still carries the mark of evil. It won't stay safe for long." Lila and I climbed the stairs, leaving the basement locked forever. But something didn't feel right. As we left the house, I looked back and saw a shadow in the reflection of the basement window. It was watching us, its eyes faintly glowing in the dark. We never returned to that house, but sometimes at night, I still hear the voice of the demon whispering in my dreams. "I'll be back, Nathan." The door never fully closes. I knew that New Orleans had a rich and mysterious history, but I never imagined that something could involve me so directly. My name is Lisa Morgan, and I am a visual arts student. I've always loved exploring old and peculiar places, and this city seemed like a paradise for someone as curious as I am. But that curiosity almost destroyed me. It all began on a Saturday afternoon. I was walking through the French Quarter, enjoying my free time exploring antique shops. That's when I found a small store tucked away in a narrow alley. The rusted sign at the entrance read, "Madame Clara's Treasures." Something drew me inside. The store was an organized chaos. Shelves filled with dusty books, boxes of old jewelry, and African masks hanging on the walls. There was the smell of burning incense and something else metallic, almost like rust. That's when I saw it. A doll sitting on a shelf in the back of the shop. It was different from anything I had ever seen. Small, made of dark wood, and wearing a delicate lace dress that seemed to be centuries old. Its glass eyes were so lifelike that, for a moment, I had the feeling it was watching me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice startled me. I turned around and saw an elderly woman, probably Madame Clara, with penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Yes, it's unique," I replied, trying to sound confident. Madame Clara gave a small smile, but her eyes grew serious. "This doll is not an ordinary object. It belonged to Eloise Devereaux, a practitioner of voodoo. Many say she cursed this doll, using it as a vessel to store part of her soul." I laughed, thinking she was just trying to make the story more interesting to sell the item. "Well, stories like that are what make things more valuable, right?" Madame Clara's smile faded. "This is not a story, girl. It's a warning. If you take this doll, you must understand that it carries something dark." Still, I bought it. Maybe it was the fascination with the story, maybe it was the challenge. But deep down, I knew I should have listened to the warning. That night I placed the doll on a shelf in my room. With its presence, the room seemed to gain a strange weight. The air felt denser, more stifling, but I ignored it. It started slowly. First, there were the noises, the sound of light footsteps on the wooden floor during the night, even when I was alone. Then, things started to move. A chair I had left in the corner of the room was turned when I returned from the kitchen. My keys appeared in the bathroom, even though I was sure I had left them on the table. And then came the dreams. I dreamed of a woman I had never seen before. She was tall, with long hair and pale skin that glowed in the candlelight. In every dream, she was on an altar, surrounded by strange symbols, holding the doll. Her lips moved, but her words were whispered in a language I didn't understand. On the last night, the dream was different. The woman looked directly at me and clearly said, "You opened the door. Now, you cannot close it." I woke up in a panic, drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, but I knew something was wrong. When I looked at the foot of the bed, my heart stopped. The doll, which had been on the shelf, was now sitting there, leaning forward as if it were watching me. I screamed and turned on the light, but the doll didn't move. I grabbed it and threw it in a box, locking it in a cupboard. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights on. The next morning, I decided to get rid of it. I took the box and threw it in a trash can on the corner. But when I came back home, there it was, sitting on the shelf again, as if it had never left. That's when I realized I couldn't handle this on my own. I needed help before it was too late. I knew I needed help. After the doll came back to my shelf on its own, there was no ignoring what was happening anymore. I grabbed my phone and searched for Madame Clara's number, the owner of the store where I bought it. "I warned you not to take it," Madame Clara said, her voice heavy with concern as I explained the situation. "You freed Eloise Devereaux. Now she's trapped between worlds, trying to use you as a portal to return fully." "How can I get rid of her?" I asked, desperation overflowing in my voice. There was a pause. "It won't be easy. But if you have enough courage, you can face Eloise and seal her soul back into the doll." She instructed me to come to her shop that night. Hesitant, I went. The store seemed even more oppressive at night, with shadows dancing on the walls and the smell of incense stronger than ever. Madame Clara prepared everything in a room at the back. There were candles lit around a circle drawn on the floor with white chalk. The center of the circle was reserved for the doll, which I brought in a bag. As soon as I placed it there, the air in the room seemed to change. "The ritual will require your strength and courage," Clara said. "You need to face Eloise. She'll try to manipulate you, but you cannot give in. If you manage to seal her back, the curse will be broken. If not..." She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what it meant. The ritual began with Clara reciting words in a language I didn't understand. The air grew heavier, and the candles began to flicker, as if an invisible wind passed through the room. The smell of something burning filled the space, and I felt something cold touch my skin, like invisible hands. Suddenly, the lights went out, leaving only the dim glow of the candles. When I looked at the doll, I saw something horrifying. It wasn't still anymore. Its hands moved slowly, and its glass eyes glowed with an ominous light. A low laugh echoed through the room, and then Eloise appeared. Eloise's figure materialized in the center of the circle. She was tall, with long black hair that floated as if submerged in water. Her eyes were completely black, and her smile revealed teeth as sharp as blades. "You were foolish to bring me here," she said, her voice booming like thunder. "Now, there's no turning back." She stepped forward, but the chalk circle seemed to hold her back. Still, I felt her presence invade my mind. Nightmarish visions flooded my mind, images of death, destruction, and bloody rituals performed by Eloise in the past. "I can free you from this torment," she whispered, her voice sweet and deceiving. "All you have to do is let me go." My head was pounding, but I remembered Clara's words. "Don't give in." "You won't deceive me," I shouted, facing the fear. Eloise laughed again, but her expression changed. Now she looked enraged, and the room began to tremble. The candles went out, and darkness took over. With Clara's guidance, I began reciting the words of the ritual she had taught me. My voice trembled, but I kept going. Eloise screamed, her figure writhing like smoke trying to escape. "You can't defeat me. I am eternal." But the words seemed to work. The doll began to vibrate, and Eloise was slowly sucked back into it. Her figure grew smaller and smaller until only the doll remained, motionless in the center of the circle. Clara quickly placed the doll in a wooden box decorated with protective symbols and locked it with an iron key. "It's done," she said, but her voice carried a tone of warning. "Eloise is sealed again, but her presence will never be completely erased. You must leave New Orleans and never look back." I obeyed without hesitation. I left the city the next day, abandoning everything. For a while I thought I was free, but months later I received a package with no return address. Inside, I found a piece of the doll's dress and a note with a single sentence, "I'll be back." I had no idea what awaited us that night. My name is Eric Thompson, and my idea was simple. Film a documentary about St. Mary's Hospital, a place that everyone in Baltimore avoided. It was an old, abandoned building surrounded by stories of missing patients and hauntings. To me, it was the perfect setting for a horror project. I was wrong. My friends Mia, Dylan, and Sophia agreed to join. Mia was my recording partner, always ready for any adventure. Dylan, ever the skeptic, was only there to laugh at our paranoias. And Sophia, well, Sophia was different. She seemed to hesitate, as if she knew what was about to happen. We arrived at the hospital at midnight. The building was imposing, its broken windows reflecting the moonlight. The air was cold and the wind carried a smell of mold and rusted metal. The exterior walls were covered with graffiti, but some words seemed recent. "Do not enter." "Perfect," Dylan said, holding a flashlight. "What a cliché of a place." Mia laughed, but Sophia stayed silent, staring at the entrance. "Something's wrong here," she murmured. "The place feels alive." I ignored the comment and pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, as if the hospital was warning us to stay out. We entered, and the darkness swallowed us. The main hallway was dusty, with papers scattered on the floor. Medical files, old charts, and even broken medication bottles filled the air with a sense of abandonment and chaos. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it at the walls. They were covered in dark stains that looked like dried blood. The marks weren't random. They formed strange symbols drawn with eerie precision. "Someone's had too much free time," Dylan joked, but even he seemed uneasy. "These symbols, they look like rituals," Sophia said, gently touching one of them. We continued walking, Mia's camera recording every detail. We reached a room that seemed to have been used for surgeries. In the center, there was a rusted table, covered by a dark, stained sheet. "Bet there's a mannequin under this," Dylan said, laughing. Mia pulled off the sheet, but there was nothing there. At least nothing we could see. Still, I swear I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, like a shadow slipping through the door. "Did anyone see that?" I asked, but everyone shook their heads. As we explored, the sounds began. At first it was soft footsteps, like someone walking barefoot upstairs. Then came low whispers, barely audible, coming from every direction. Sophia stopped suddenly. "Eric, I feel something," she said, looking into the room beside us. "Something's watching us." Dylan rolled his eyes. "You've been watching too many horror movies, Sophia." But I knew she wasn't imagining it. The air in the hospital felt different, heavy, as if something invisible was pressing down on us. We came to an old medical filing room. Piles of files were scattered on the floor, some with faded photographs of patients. One of the names caught my attention. Harlan Finch. "Isn't he the doctor who did those experiments?" I asked. Sophia nodded, her voice quiet. "He did experimental lobotomies. They say he believed he could cure sick souls, but ended up destroying people. No one knows how many died here because of him." One file had a red X marked on it. When I opened it, I felt a chill. It was the record of a patient, but the last note simply said, "Transferred to final surgery." "This is sick," Mia said, turning off the camera for a moment. "This place should be demolished." Suddenly, we heard a loud noise. Something fell at the end of the hallway. We rushed to see and found a gurney that had been pushed into the middle of the path. "The wind must have done that," Dylan said, but his voice trembled slightly. Sophia looked at us with wide eyes. "It's not the wind. He's here." We tried to leave, but the door we came through was locked. When I looked at Mia, something froze my blood. On her camera's viewfinder, a figure was reflected in the window behind us. It was a tall man, wearing a lab coat with his face covered by a blood-stained surgical mask. "Run!" I screamed, and we started running down the hall, but the sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, closer. When I looked back, I saw the lights flickering, and the man vanished into the darkness. We knew we weren't alone, and whatever was with us wanted us to stay forever. The sound of footsteps wouldn't stop. They echoed through the hospital's hallways, growing louder with every second. We knew something was chasing us, but every time we looked back, we only saw shadows dancing in the darkness. "Eric, what do we do?" Mia asked, breathless, her camera trembling in her hands. I had no answers. All we knew was that we were trapped in there, with a presence that seemed to be enjoying hunting us down. Sophia stopped suddenly and grabbed my arm. "Over here," she said, pointing to a slightly open door. It was an operating room. We ran inside, but as soon as we closed the door, we heard a low, almost inhuman laugh echoing down the hallway. The room was submerged in dim light, with an emergency light flickering in the corner. There were rusted gurneys, surgical tables covered by sheets, and tools that seemed untouched since the day the hospital shut down. In the center of the room, an operating table seemed to beckon us, with handprints imprinted on the metal covered in rust and something that looked like dried blood. "This place is worse than I imagined," I muttered, trying to keep calm. Dylan laughed nervously. "It's just an old hospital, guys. We'll get out of here." But when he said that, we heard a click. The door behind us had locked by itself. The sound of metal instruments hitting the floor echoed as if someone had knocked them down. We all froze, looking at the source of the noise. On the operating table, something began to move under the sheet. Mia took a step back. "It can't be. There's no one here." When the sheet slipped, we saw a humanoid figure, twisted, covered in scars and stitch marks. Its eyes were sewn shut, but it still seemed to be looking at us. The creature got up, moving in disjointed motions, and pointed at Sophia. "The surgery is scheduled," it said, in a hoarse, terrifying voice, which seemed to come from deep within the room. We turned to face the voice, and there he was, Dr. Harlan Finch. Finch's figure was a living nightmare. He wore a blood-stained lab coat, and a surgical mask covered part of his disfigured face. He held a rusty saw in one hand and a pair of forceps in the other. "You came to my hospital," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "And now, you will meet the final cure." The entire room began to shake. The lights flickered violently and whispers filled the air, as if the hospital's walls were speaking. Sophia screamed as Finch slowly advanced toward her. I tried to hold her back, but something shoved me away. An invisible force that seemed to want to separate us. "He's choosing her," Mia screamed, trying to pull Sophia back. I knew we had to do something. In the chaos, I noticed a cabinet on the side of the room, with glass jars filled with dark liquid. I grabbed one of the jars, breaking it on the floor. The smell was unbearable, like rotting flesh. Dr. Finch stopped, staring directly at me. "That belongs to them," he said, pointing to the jars. "You shouldn't touch what you don't understand." Then I realized those jars contained remains of the patients he had operated on. Blood, perhaps pieces of organs, something that still tied their spirits to the hospital. "If I destroy this, they'll be freed," I thought, gathering my courage. As Finch advanced toward me, I knocked all the jars to the floor. The liquid spilled, and screams echoed in the room, screams that weren't ours. They were the spirits of the patients, finally freed. Finch's figure began to writhe, as if being torn apart from the inside out. He tried to advance, but shadows began pulling him into the floor. "This isn't over!" he screamed, before vanishing completely. The room fell silent except for the sound of our heavy breathing. The door unlocked on its own, and we ran out of the hospital. As we stepped outside, the sun was beginning to rise. The fresh air had never felt so good, but none of us spoke a word. We were marked by that night. Later, when reviewing the footage, we saw something that made our blood freeze again. In the last scene filmed by Mia's camera before she turned it off, Dr. Finch appears, standing in the darkness, staring directly at us with a sinister smile. We never returned to St. Mary's Hospital, but sometimes, on nights of absolute silence, I still hear the sound of a surgical saw coming from somewhere far away.